I'm going to do a sound check. Is this too loud, too quiet? Somewhere in between? Good?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to actually start us off with a quote to bring us into the Rachel Carson Center. And a couple of weeks ago, one of the many serendipitous things that's happened to me here is actually learning more about Rachel Carson, who is an American like me, but I haven't really fully realized the power of her work until I've seen in this context in the center how much her work has inspired so many people. And this is one of the quotes that really inspired me that I discovered a couple weeks ago. So this is from her essay on the biological sciences from 1958. Here and there, awareness is growing that man, far from being the overlord of all creation, is himself part of nature, subject to the same cosmic forces that control all other life. Man's future welfare, and probably even his survival, depend upon his learning to live in harmony rather than in combat with these forces. So I want you guys to keep this quote in mind as I unveil the Mistral. So it struck me when I read this quote that Rachel Carson's line of thinking was very pertinent to the book project I've been working on since coming to the RCC in July, which is a history of a particularly violent and a particularly destructive force of nature, which is the Mistral wind and the relationship between this wind and people living in the south of France. So in its very name, the Mistral reflects the limits of man's power to control nature. So the term Mistral derives from the Latin word magister or magistralis, which means the master. And the mastery of this wind has actually been well documented going all the way back to ancient Greece. And so there's a wonderful quote from the ancient Greek geographer Strabo that this was a wind that throws men from their horses and strips them of their weapons and their clothes. Hard to tell which was more important. But so at this time that the Greeks first conquered Marseille, which they called Massalia, classical Greek civilization conceptualized nature's mastery by creating deities. And some of these deities are actually represented on a famous tower that exists in Athens, Greece, called the Tower of Winds. And on each of this tower's 8 sides is a different wind god that you see here. So you can tell in this frieze that people would depict these wind deities and try to express their major characteristics. So up north we have Boreas, who's the cold and gruff northern wind, and he has a thick coat and is you could tell he's coming from a cold place. He's kind of bound up and is this gruff old man. And then down below we have Zephyr, who is shirtless and is tossing flowers around. So that's a kind of pleasant breeze. So I want to note briefly that the civilizations that ruled southern France have actually always described this wind as a masculine force. So those of you that are working on gender might be interested in mulling this around a little bit. Like the wind gods that I just showed you, the Mistral is always gendered male. So the French word for wind, le vent, and the name le Mistral are both masculine. And I've also found that well into the modern period, people would often describe the Mistral as a wind that was like a mighty political ruler, using words like a king of the winds, or emperor. And thus sort of really putting the Mistral in a position of power and dominance over the land that it reigned. So something interesting to note. But before I move on, I want to play the role of weather woman just for a second, just to give you a sense of the grounded role of this wind in the south of France. So, and I'm not trained as a weather woman, so let me do my best. So it starts off in a high pressure zone over the Massif Central mountain range and descends down into the Mediterranean Sea. And this movement of air is really caused by 2 factors. First, air naturally, by the laws of physics, wants to move from a colder high-pressure zone to a low-pressure zone. So it's naturally kind of moving down from this mountain range into the sea. But in addition to this, the topography of the south of France actually creates, between the Alps and the Massif Central, a sort of funnel. So as the air is descending down, it gets compressed like in a garden hose between these two mountain ranges. And that causes it to go even more quickly, so that by the time it reaches the south of France, the coastal area, it can blow at speeds of up to 100 kilometers or 60 miles an hour. So not just your average breeze, but a truly violent and destructive force. So when this force of nature hits a body or an object, destructions or transformations often result. And I want to begin actually with some peasant proverbs that were very common in the south of France for a long period of time. It takes a Mistral to pull the tail off a donkey. It takes a Mistral to dehorn the bulls. The Mistral takes the roots off the wheat. And some of my favorites are the ones where people embody the wind's characteristics. So a couchot Mistral is a man who exaggerates or whose words go faster than the wind. I suppose we should look at some more sophisticated writers as well. So the French 19th century historian Jules Michelet, poetic Provence is nonetheless a savage landscape. The gusts of winds, brisk and powerful, can have a fatal grasp. It is a nature that is capricious, passionate, angry, and charming. There's also the work of Alexandre Dumas, who famously wrote The Count of Monte Cristo. The icy breath of the Mistral has a sharp chilliness unknown to the inhabitants of the north of France, and which, instead of penetrating through the skin, seizes on the marrow of the bones and paralyzes you. So I'm writing a book about the Mistral in French history because I want to know more about how people learn to coexist with a force of nature like this. A force of nature that was really capable of mastering people. And this is not the narrative that we often hear these days in the environmental humanities. It's often more about how people have controlled nature. So I'm interested in the kind of how exploring this wind might open up some new avenues to thinking about this relationship between nature and people. So I'm writing about how the Mistral's dynamic materiality impacted everything from human bodies to human movements, their types of dwellings, their forms of energy, their scientific technologies, in addition to creative forms of expression like poetry, literature, and art. And while I touch on some earlier time periods, the temporal focus of my book is the 19th century. And the reason for this is in the 19th century, human relationships with the wind underwent really their greatest transformation. So industrialization, the centralization of the French state, the transition from organic to carbon-based economies all rearranged human relationships with nature's dominance. So these changes, I argue, create new modes of encountering and understanding and visualizing the Mistral. So what I want to do in this part of the talk is to briefly walk you through my thought processes for how I'm telling the story of this changing relationship between people and the wind in the 19th century. So I actually begin by excavating the Mistral's role in traditional economic livelihoods in Provence. And here I'm talking in particular about sailors, farmers, shepherds, and millers, people whose livelihoods really defined life in Provence for many centuries. And I examine how these common laborers' bodies were impacted by the Mistral and how they developed practical strategies for living with this wind. And this is a topic that Elena will be discussing in greater detail in her talk. So something maybe to keep in your memory and save for when she gives her her talk in a few minutes. So because these chapters are focused on laboring people in Provence and traditional livelihoods, I'm trying to excavate here the history of people that are often forgotten in the historical record. It's hard to find their voices in history. So you have to be a little bit creative in the kinds of archives that you use to explore this history. So one of the sources that I turned to in the archives that I really enjoyed working with was Vernacular Architecture. So I found this to be a very useful archive for exploring how people developed these simple strategies for coexisting with the Mistral's gusts. And one of my favorite examples are these huts that you see here from the Camargue wetlands in southern France. And so these huts are actually rudimentary homes that are built by working fishermen and horse guardians out of the reeds that grew up around them. And you can actually see in these images created by Vincent Van Gogh, he was very fascinated by these houses, and they had this very curious shape. And you can see how he actually used a reed pen to draw this reed landscape with the reed houses that are organically kind of popping out of this landscape. So it's an example of what architectural historians call design with nature. Okay, so using sort of the nature around you to create a form of dwelling or habitation. And actually, some of these architectural historians have gone back and actually realized that this particular shape of housing with the rounded end has been proven to actually have less wind turbulence and less noise than a traditional rectangular house. So the swirls you see here are the turbulence created by just a regular shaped house versus the rounded type. So again, the kind of brilliance of like ordinary people, how they learn to adapt. So similar to these people living in the Camargue, we also have the sailors. The maritime economies were always a really big deal in Provence. And so boat design, like housing design, also reflected this sort of smart, strategic cohabitation. So what we see here are some examples of boats like Allège and Tartane, which are sailing vessels that are designed to have to move quickly in the wind, so that in the case of a Mistral, they can bring their boats into shelter. In addition, there are, from generation to generation, sailors would learn tacking techniques from their fathers or their grandfathers. How do you actually learn to move in a dynamic wind-blown environment? They would also have mental maps in their heads about where is a safe cove to go to in the Calanque, like where can you find shelter. So in the next part of my book, I discuss this role reversal that begins to happen in the mid-19th century, where the traditional life ways of people working in Provence begin to disappear, and the rising middle classes and an expanding French state become more interested in taming the Mistral than in adapting to it. So in the eyes of the central French government, the Mistral's unpredictable presence in Provence and its unruly, destructive power were increasingly seen as a challenge to the efficiency and the regularity that a modern European economy demanded. So this was sort of the way of thinking in Europe in the 19th century. So in an attempt to make the weather more predictable, the state, along with members of civil society, pushed for new forms of weather knowledge generated by machines. So Provence's sort of premier weather station is located on the top of Mont Ventoux, which is the highest elevation in that part of France, completed in 1884. And you can see, in contrast to the Camargue huts, this is a kind of architectural design that's meant to confront nature. It does not organically develop out of it. It's made of steel and concrete and is meant to kind of rebuff the wind. So to measure the wind, scientists use devices called anemometers, and these are devices that measure wind speed based on the number of rotations per minute. So from their post at the top of this observatory, sort of working class laborers called observateurs would go outside and try to measure this wind. And it's interesting to note that the reports that came back from this observatory showed that actually not a single anemometer was actually able to survive outside on Mont Ventoux. The wind destroyed every single machine that was installed on the observatory platform, every single one. And therefore, people had to carry these handheld anemometers was the only way to kind of measure wind speed, which is a notoriously difficult thing to measure scientifically. But nonetheless, it was difficult to really notice that messiness of the science in the documents that came out of this observatory. So the wind measurements were sent via telegraph wire, dug into the soil, sent to Paris, where scientists would tabulate this data and create images such as this one. So the Mistral kind of goes from being this vibrant force to being something that on paper looks pretty tame, pretty masterable, and pretty dull. And actually, it's interesting to note that the very word Mistral fades away and is replaced simply by the word northwest wind. And the Mistral is sort of seen as a colloquial, sort of cultural word. So in addition to the construction of these new observatories, a major energy transition was taking place that would shift the Mistral's role in Provence's economy. So over the course of the 19th century, windmills, which were a vital yet unreliable source of locally generated power, were slowly all collapsing to the ground. They fell into disuse as steam power took over. And it was interesting for me to discover in French literature that the trope of the collapsed windmill was seen as this really tragic moment in the history of the south of France. And I want to briefly read a quote from a novel by, or a collection of short stories by Alphonse Daudet, who was very distressed at the collapse of these windmills. So this is what he wrote. There was once a flourishing flour milling trade here, and farmers from 10 leagues around would bring us their wheat to grind. All the hills surrounding the village were covered with windmills. Whichever way you looked, all you could see were sails turning in the Mistral above the pine trees. These windmills, you see, were not only a source of riches, but were also a source of great joy to our land. Unfortunately, some Frenchmen in Paris had the idea of setting up a steam-powered flour mill on the road to Tarascon. All shiny and new it was, so people got into the habit of sending their wheat to the steam mill. And soon the poor windmills stood idle. For a time they tried to compete, but steam power was stronger, and alas, one after another they were forced to close. However much the Mistral blew, the sails stood still. Then, one fine day, the village council had all of those old buildings demolished. So Daudet's parable of wind energy's collapse in Provence reflected a much larger trend in late 19th century French art and literature. Many French artists at this time felt a sense of malaise at French society's growing estrangement from the natural environment. And in the last part of my book, I explore how these 19th century artists in Provence tried to reestablish meaningful relationships with the Mistral through their direct bodily and sensory encounters. So artists in Provence, I discovered, tended to represent the Mistral from two distinct points of view. So first we have a regionalist school of art called the École de Marseille. And this group of painters were very nostalgic for the traditional ways of life that they saw disappearing from Provence, even though the vast majority of them came from the bourgeois classes themselves. So the Mistral, from these regional artists' perspective, was a source of inspiration. The Mistral was their muse, and it reminded them of their homeland and their connections, their sort of physical and psychological connections to their little homeland. So their paintings often looked like this, sort of images of these heroic shepherds or farmers or sailors struggling against the Mistral in their daily labor, their sort of pure everyday labor. And for these artists, the Mistral was a material force that unified the people of Provence. It is what they had in common with each other, this shared environment. And in the words of one regional writer, the Mistral even gave the Provençal language what he called its storm-like cachet. So in their view, the collective struggle of working and living in Provence's unique environment is what made them physically, temperamentally, and psychologically distinct from other people in France, Parisians, people from Brittany, etc. Other 19th century artists, however, painted the Mistral from a very different perspective. So Impressionist painters like Claude Monet were not so much interested in building a collective cultural identity out of nature, but they were rather interested in using landscape painting to capture their personal impressions of a nature that was very dynamic, that was fluid, that was moving, an idea that was itself very modern, that there's just this constant change. And so the Impressionist painters were deeply committed to engaging their bodies in the artistic process. So like the shepherds and like the sailors, they painted outside, en plein air. And rather than seek to control the Mistral's appearance for sort of narrative purposes, they allowed their physical encounter between their skin and this wind to inspire them and give them sort of a sensory impression. And so in this case, we really see the quick, energetic brush strokes that Monet is using, giving us a kind of a visceral sense of this Mistral sweeping across the landscape. And perhaps the most famous modern artist to depict the Mistral was Vincent Van Gogh, who, like Monet, was an outsider who flocked to Provence in search of its inspiring landscapes. So Van Gogh had sort of a love-hate relationship with the Mistral. Though he bitterly called the Mistral, quote, a devil that, quote, did not make him happy, he nonetheless committed himself to going outdoors while the Mistral was blowing. He even developed a method for hammering in his easel into the ground while the Mistral was blowing that he showed off in this letter to his brother Theo, saying, look, I can hammer this easel into the ground and paint and sketch as this wind is blowing. And the result was a canvas that reflected the wind's material impact on the landscape, as well as its impact on the artist's interior world and on the artist's psyche as well. So I conclude my book and this presentation with these works of art because I think they provide us with an entryway into thinking about our own relationship with the power and the mystery of the natural world. In their struggle to represent the Mistral's unruly force on a two-dimensional canvas, these 19th century artists were trying to figure out how to relate to nature as modern people, particularly at a time when nature's power seemed to be diminishing across Europe. And they also, I think, seem to be answering Rachel Carson's call to think of ourselves as part of nature and to seek ways to live in harmony rather than in combat with its forces. So thank you very much for having me.